Hello, friends. Pastor Jeff here, continuing our summer book study using the recent book by Bishop Curry, Love is the Way, Holding on to Hope in Troubling Times. This week, we're working our way through chapter 7 together, the title of which is Leave No One Behind. And the question he poses to us is, I'm told to love my neighbor, but who is my neighbor? An allusion, of course, to the story of the parable rather, of the Good Samaritan. Jesus tells this homespun story in response to a lawyer's infamous question when he's wrestling with what does it mean to love my neighbor, and asks Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And he goes on to tell this famous parable of the Good Samaritan, who will be the one who cares for the person, loves the person right in front of them with pressing need. And so that parable kind of lingers over the whole chapter for us, but Bishop Curry really focuses on the part of his personal narrative that happened in Baltimore, where he was rector of St. James Parish there in the Lafayette Square neighborhood of Baltimore for several years. I think it was his last parish call before he became a bishop in North Carolina and eventually would become, as you know today, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the U.S. So he had his call in Lincoln Heights, Ohio, you remember from the last couple chapters, and now he's in Baltimore, and he tells some fascinating stories about watching a fellow clergy colleague, Jewish rabbi, with whom they were doing some work, talk about her experience being a Holocaust survivor and just how arresting, obviously, that whole story was and horrifying, but that it didn't really sink into him at a visceral level until, as she was speaking, she had to lift up her hand for some reason, and it revealed, as her sleeve came down from her blouse, the tattoo she'd been given with a number, deeming her as an object, not a subject, an object, by the Nazis. And Reverend Curry focuses on how that absolutely drew him into the story in a deeper way, and he reflected on how could anyone ever treat this lovable human being, this child of God, in such a way. He goes on to cite a book he read in college, which you may have heard of or read yourself, by the Jewish rabbi and existentialist philosopher Martin Buber. The book is titled I and Thou, and the whole book has a very simple but profound point. The whole book is about the fact that in our own experience we have I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. I-it relationships being relationships between a subject, a person, and a thing, whether that thing is something that has utility for us, like our car or a tool or something. But then the relationships he talks about in the latter half of the book are I-thou, subject to subject, person to person. And Buber talks about the tragedy of dealing with other human beings as if they are its, if they are subjects, if they're objects rather, and that being the tragedy of not recognizing the belovedness of another person in front of us, the fact that they too are children of God, and of course that being the whole point behind Nazism, of trying to create this sort of superior race of human being, as if others are inferior and some are superior. He segues though into his experience in Baltimore and how many of its black and brown residents had been treated as treated as less than, disinvested in their communities, opportunities, education, jobs, and so on and so forth. His particular church that he served while he was in Baltimore, St. James, was located in the Lafayette Square neighborhood, and a neighborhood that had experienced just upheaval and so much deterioration and change. It was the late 80s and mid 90s when he served there, so the height of the drug wars and the crack cocaine epidemic in Baltimore, homicide almost every day. His parish was right in the thick of that. Many of the church members no longer lived there. They commuted in from elsewhere, but they had a moment when they needed to decide, we're not going to leave anyone behind. We're not going to treat the members of our community, our neighbors, as its, but rather as thous. And so he tells stories of members of their congregation who started, I think, the St. James Academy, as it was known, that worked on education and tutoring and even some healthcare, as well as various partnerships they participated in with local interfaith communities. The end of the chapter focuses on this tragic event that occurred when a thunderstorm led to a lightning strike that burned part of their building down, somewhat like the Cathedral of Notre Dame, tragically, just the same. Much of it was wood, and so that part completely burned. But he talked about how that experience of death, that experience of loss and tragedy, actually led to a remarkable rebirth, a remarkable renewal of focus on the neighborhood to which they had been called. How do we remain here and share God's love with all our neighbors, all the poor, the disenfranchised, those facing gang violence, drug addiction, right in our midst? He tells a beautiful story about a drug dealer he worked with for years, whom he calls Eddie, in the midst of the AIDS epidemic and so many other challenges, which is quite a story. You'll have to read it when you get there. He also talks about local communities. They partnered together to engage in street corner preaching and revivals that they held, partnering with police organizations nearby, doing caroling during the holidays. These ways of asking questions. How do we love our neighbors, the neighbors who are right here, right now in our midst? And so, friends, as I wrap this chapter up, I have to admit to you, I've had similar questions on my heart and mind. Here we are at the corner of 9th and Greenleaf in Wilmette. Needs in our own community for our own neighbors are less visible, shall we say, less drastic perhaps, but no less calling out for our response, for our joining, for our support, for our prayer, for our partnering. And I wonder, friends, about, as we emerge out of this pandemic, what's been revealed in the areas of loneliness, of addiction, of mental illness, of so many other things. How might God be asking us to love our neighbors right here in our midst, whether they become church members or not? That isn't so much the point. The point is to love them as God's children. Maybe they become church members, maybe they don't, but our mission is to be here to love our neighbors. And so I wonder, friends, if you've had similar thoughts and what God is speaking to you regarding this moment of our church's life and how we too can participate in the way of love in this time and in this place. See you next week, friends, for chapter 8. Peace to you.